Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
Kyle Whelton of Sheboygan is a Democrat running in the 9th Senate District. Kyle, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Steve, thank you for having me.
Top issue in your campaign? You're trying to unseat an incumbent. Top issue?
Education, public education.
Well, the current state budget significantly increased state aid to K-12.
Yep.
It's not enough? Do we need a lot more in the next budget?
Yes, and
why?
So I'll talk about this. As a school board member, I can tell you firsthand the damage that's happened with the cuts that we experienced in the first 6 years of the governor's administration. And that increase was necessary, and it's provided resources that have been deeply appreciated. But it was a Band-Aid over a bleeding wound, right? What we've seen is that Darien-Delavan School District has laid off 39 teachers and closed an elementary school. Arena Pac just closed their doors entirely and now are sending their students out there. We're still struggling for resources. And in my district, Manitowoc school system had a referendum that passed this past spring, but they just had a ceiling collapse in their high school, right? That's facilities maintenance and other things that get cut back over time as we've struggled with resources. And part of that as well is they've restricted the ability for school board members to make decisions about tax levies. And
that's the levy limits issue.
That is.
Should we get rid of levy limits? Excuse me for interrupting. But
no, that's sure. I believe that locally elected officials should be allowed to make decisions that make sense for their communities.
Okay.
And what I've seen in talking with mayors and aldermen and also as a school board member, I can tell you is that these levy limits have stifled growth. It's made it really hard for us to put the resources in that we need to, especially with shared revenues being capped and limited back. So we've limited the ability for local municipalities to raise property taxes, and then on top of that, we've combined it with lower shared revenues from the state. We've really starved it. And then compound that with the number of dark store lawsuits that we've got going on. I mean, we're at risk of losing hundreds of thousands of tax revenue just from lawsuits from one corporation in Sheboygan County alone. And a lot of times, that's revenue that just disappears. It doesn't come back because we're capped at the levy limits, or it gets passed on to local property taxpayers. So I do believe that we need to move away with that and allow locally elected officials to make those decisions for their communities.
And if you needed to raise, if a legislature and governor needed to raise 300, 400 million more for aid to public schools, where would you find it? Would you change the tax structure to bring in more revenue?
Sure. So budgets are a statement of values and priorities. And I think that one of the things we can examine is some of the tax credits that have been in place that perhaps aren't paying off the way that we initially intended them to. I think an example of this is the Wisconsin Manufacturing Agricultural Tax Credit. That tax credit provided $21.5 million in tax breaks to 11 individuals, all of whom made over $30 million in 2016. When asked on open records request where the job creation was in this tax credit, the governor's administration couldn't produce anything. And so as we look at this, we need to make sure that we are tying these credits to job creation. I'm okay with investing in that if it's going to produce something, but to reduce that much revenue and not see any job creation as a direct result of it, that's concerning. I think the other piece here is that we can look at other areas in the budget where we're spending significant resources. We're spending more on corrections than we are the UW system, over $1 billion on prisons alone.
So we don't need a new prison?
No, I think, and I'm not the only person who believes this, right? Former Governor Tommy Thompson just came out last week or a few weeks ago saying he's really sorry about the lock 'em up craze that was started under his administration and that we're incarcerating too many people now that should be in rehabilitation. And so now we've got a recidivism issue. It makes it difficult for these people to find gainful employment after they've served their time. I think Wisconsin should be finding ways to reform our criminal justice system so that we're we're not locking up so many nonviolent offenders.
Let's go back to K-12 for a minute.
Sure.
Part of that debate is the expanding choice and voucher program, Milwaukee to Racine, now statewide. Your position on choice?
Sure. So I am opposed to the voucher program. I do not believe in shifting public funds to private schools. And Wisconsin is struggling to fund one K-12 education system right now. We can't afford to fund two of them. And I am always going to pick public education, which guarantees every child a quality education and a shot at the middle class, regardless of parents' income, belief, or ability.
UW system budget. Should the tuition freeze on resident undergrad be continued for 7th and 8th year?
I am okay with continuing the tuition freeze as long as it is coupled with increased commitment and funding from the state. When you cap tuition revenue and then continue to cut what's coming in from the state, you're starving the university. And we've seen that at UW-Stevens Point, which announced they're going to reduce a number of programs and limit opportunities there for students. And honestly, this is an investment that we should be making. The UW system is the economic driver, economic engine of Wisconsin. Every dollar that we put into the UW system returns 24 into the economy. We've cut, what, $500 million from the UW system over the last 10 years? That's $12 billion out of our economy. That is a critical loss. To me, there's no reason for us to continue to go back to higher ed and push it away like that.
Part of the debate on criminal justice in prison is whether we should legalize recreational marijuana and medical marijuana. Your position?
I've talked about this a lot with folks in my district going around, and every time it comes up, what I hear is that marijuana is not something that we should be locking people up for. I've thought about this, but we absolutely should be legalizing medical marijuana, and I think we should also legalize recreational. Tax it, regulate it. I don't believe in allowing minors to have access to it. I think that at least 21, perhaps if not higher, based on the brain chemistry that's involved with that. But I think at this point, it doesn't make sense for us to be focusing law enforcement on marijuana offenses when we've got bigger issues to tackle.
You alluded to this earlier. I want to come back to it. The billions in potential tax breaks for Foxconn. Now Kimberly-Clark wants similar tax breaks. What's the criteria that state government should help private businesses? When?
This is a great question. I think that it's something that we have to weigh on a case-by-case basis. I think my litmus test is we've got to look at what is the cost to our local economy, what are we losing, what does that do to working families in the area, what's the opportunities for reemployment that come there if we lose a company such as Kimberly-Clark. I am concerned about the precedent that we're setting in this state, that companies can demand taxpayer dollars and set a deadline or an arbitrary line, and the legislature and the governor will hand it over. I don't believe that Madison should be in the game of picking winners and losers, and that what we saw with Foxconn is that we inserted ourselves into a market decision, and now other companies. I think about the businesses in my district that have been investing in their community, providing family supporting wages, playing by the rules for generations. They didn't receive any refundable tax credits. They didn't have environmental regulations waived when they were looking to expand their plants. It's just not fair. And so I think that's a bit of the framework that I approach that with.
So you would have voted against both Foxconn and Kimberly-Clark?
Yes.
As a school board member, the state just set aside $100 million for school safety grants. Is that enough, or do we need to change gun laws?
I'm a gun owner myself. Received a shotgun when I was 13 years old and hunted. I do believe, though, that we need common sense gun safety legislation to ensure that everyone feels safe in their communities and in their schools. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't pass universal background checks, which are supported by a vast majority of both registered gun owners and voters. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't pass a 48-hour waiting period on the purchase of firearms. The safety grants are appreciated, What I can tell you is that for some smaller rural districts, the requirements on them just to get the funds were so arduous that it was difficult for them to apply for it, or that they didn't qualify for the funds. And so I think there's more work to be done there, and I think that there are ways that we can address this in ensuring that we've got student safety resource officers in all school districts. They help build community and they keep students safe.
The impasse in the Capitol over highway funding, bridge construction, maintenance, and repairs, how would you break it?
I think that there's some significant common ground here, and the issue comes down to just how we pay for it. I'm not in support of the amount of debt service we have on our transportation budget right now. 22 cents on every dollar paid into transportation goes to interest on the debt. I think we have to evaluate every option. At minimum, we need to index the gas tax so that we're not kicking the can down the road and running into situations where people don't have political courage to make decisions about tax increases. I think it's also time to raise the gas tax. I don't have a specific number on that yet,
okay.
And I would want to evaluate that and talk with stakeholders. I am concerned about the impact that gas taxes have on particularly working families. They are regressive and they often hurt those that have the least to give the most. But it is how we fund our roads right now, and I think everybody can say that they're not where they should be. And a recent study shows that the average Wisconsin driver pays $637 a year in car maintenance because of the condition of our roads. That's unacceptable. So whether we're paying it in taxes or paying it in car maintenance, I'd rather put it in the taxes and make sure that we have safe roads so that communities can grow and businesses can thrive.
When potential tolling is mentioned in the Capitol, your reaction?
I'm hesitant on that right now. What I hear from a lot of people is that tolling is just not something that they're all that interested in. I'd want to see specifically what the proposal looked like, what roads we're looking at tolling, and primarily who's affected by that.
Let's turn to healthcare. What are some ways we can preserve and maybe expand healthcare in rural areas of Wisconsin?
Sure. I think the first step here is accepting the Badger Care expansion through the Affordable Care Act.
Okay.
This cost us $380 million in this budget cycle alone. And it's cost us over $1 billion over the time that this has been available, and we haven't put it in place. One of the things that when I talk with rural healthcare providers and rural communities, what they're struggling with, part of it is attracting and retaining doctors in those areas, mm-hmm. and making sure that they have it available. Badger Care provides health insurance for a large segment of the rural population. One of the things that we deal with right now is that we have a fairly low reimbursement rate, and some might even call this a hidden healthcare tax, where providers who are taking Badger Care assignment are taking on these patients and they're not being reimbursed enough to cover the cost. And so where do they make that up from? And it's tough for these providers and these hospitals out there. So I think by taking that Badger Care expansion, we can look at increasing our reimbursement rate, and also perhaps looking at ways that we can work with these health systems to provide incentives to have doctor residency programs in that area to retain more of them, attract more of them, rather than just in the larger urban centers.
Well, a quick follow-up on that. Does state government then have a role in recruiting and retaining doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals?
I think that the primary place for that still lies with the health systems, but state government can be a partner in perhaps the regulatory structure, the funding incentives that put that in place. I'm not sure if we necessarily need to be the ones directly recruiting and retaining, but we can be a partner in ensuring that the structure is in place for this to happen.
State government and Delta Dental have a partner in a program that subsidizes dental care in some low-income areas. Should this be a priority in the next Medicaid budget?
I think so. One of the things that we often overlook when it comes to healthcare actually is dental care. A lot of people dislike visiting the dentist. It doesn't bother me all that much, but what I can tell you is that keeping those teeth healthy, especially with children, is critical to that growth and development and keeping healthy and catching warning signs for chronic illness. I think that that's something we should prioritize in keeping our population healthy.
AARP is raising the question about caregivers. AARP estimates that we have 578,000 caregivers in Wisconsin who provide help for family members or next door neighbors, things like that. Do you think we need a law or a rule that allows caregivers to be a bigger part of decision making when a loved one is in a hospital, or is that not an issue that you've heard much about?
I haven't heard much about that yet.
Okay.
I'd want to sit down with stakeholders and examine the issue to see where the tension's coming in.
Yeah.
Though having elderly family, I know that it's a significant commitment for those caregivers, and we should respect that and find a way to make sure that they're involved in decision-making processes as appropriate.
Last question, you're challenging a Republican incumbent. You want to highlight differences between you and that incumbent?
Absolutely. I think the differences come in perhaps what we prioritize and what we value. I think when you look at my opponent's record, he's voted continuously to move public dollars from public schools to private schools. He's continually played politics with healthcare by avoiding the Badger Care expansion, which has cost taxpayers in the state over $1 billion. I think he's also prioritized investing in foreign companies like Foxconn rather than finding ways to build and expand the middle class here in Wisconsin. When I'm in the legislature, we're going to fully fund our public schools and ensure that every child's got a quality education and a shot at the middle class. We'll take the Badger Care expansion and work on expanding access to quality, affordable health care. And I'll work as hard as I can to support working families and build that middle class that Wisconsin once had.
Kyle Whelton of Sheboygan is a Democratic candidate in the 9th Senate District. The election is November 6th. Kyle, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, AARP Wisconsin, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.